Welcome to the panel discussion and presentation on state testing accommodations. Today, we have myself, Kristen Leslie, the director of the Special Ed Tech Center. We have Rose Roscoe on, also from the Special Ed Tech Center. Kara and Tony, you want to introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Tony Wheeler, the Director of Assessment Development here at OSPI.
Hi, I'm Kara Todd. I work on Tony's team here in the Assessment Development Office at OSPI.
Well, today you're going to see a lot of demonstration of tools. We're going to be covering Smarter Balanced, both the ELA and math and science assessments. Here you see them by grade levels, and you can see the full timelines and the calendar of testing, state testing at the link. So first off, we wanted to start by talking about AT devices and services. Some of you may know that there was some new guidance released from the Office of Special Education Programs and the Office of Education Technology around AT devices and services. We're going to share that resource today. But we know that per the Individuals with Disability Education Act, we have assistive technology devices and services defined, and they are to help to increase, maintain, or improve the functional capabilities of students eligible for special education. And this is in order to access a free and appropriate public education. In the guidance that recently came out, one of the myths, number one, is that assistive technology should only be considered at some individual education program team meetings. The fact is that each time the IEP team meets to develop, review, revise a child's IEP, that IEP team must consider whether assistive technology is required, and that's both AT devices and AT services. The IEP team must thoughtfully consider if AT devices and services are required to support the student in their educational environment, and they must document this in the IEP. And so it's documented under the special factors, and it could also be noted in other places in the IEP. We need to be reflecting in that special factors if it's required or not. We need to be asking ourselves specifically related to that student, is that assistive technology required for that student to access their general education curriculum or to make progress on their IEP goals and towards state standards? So we want to clearly document with data. And so just giving an example, say you have a student who's at the 5th grade level. They're reading at the 3rd grade level. So we would want that student, their typical performance, to access that grade level content at the 5th grade level. And so that's where we want them to be. And the current performance might be that their testing shows that when they access it on their own without those AT accommodations, the comprehension scores are at the 3rd grade level, right? So we take some data showing that when we implement text-to-speech, the student can comprehend maybe at the 4th or 5th grade level. And that data helps us make that informed decision at the IEP team meeting that that student requires assistive technology in the form of text-to-speech. So we're identifying the accommodation needed, and then we're documenting. We are documenting that again in that special factors area, but also it may be listed on the accommodations page because you're needing to include where does that student need the accommodation? When do they need the accommodation? Also including, well, they need it during testing to access the text. Briefly, we just wanted to mention accommodations versus modifications. So accommodations being how the content is presented so that the student can access the grade level content. And also this is least restrictive than a modification, and it should be that initial consideration. There's 4 types of accommodations: the way we're presenting the information, perhaps the way the student is responding. Maybe they need to use the speech to text or word prediction. It could be around timing, needing additional timing, scheduling, or even the setting that they are needing that accommodation. Modification refers to what the student is expected to learn. That's curricular modifications can be appropriate for when students have more significant disabilities and we're changing what is taught. So this is not as frequent as accommodations. Another myth from the new guidance from OSEP is around state testing, and it's myth 8. AT cannot be used for participation in state academic assessment. And then the fact is that Elementary and Secondary Education Act requires states to provide the appropriate accommodations, which includes the use of AT devices for students with disabilities as part of their state assessment. And that is why we're here today. And just so you know, around that myths and facts document, The Special Ed Tech Center is going to be diving into each myth and fact and providing some additional resources in our Tuesday tips. So you can check those out because I think there's 28 or 29 tips around assistive technology.
This page really is what resources are out there and what should you be consulting. So the guidelines for state testing, Washington calls them the guidelines on tool supports and accommodations for state testing. The link is to our WCAP portal where we keep these. Now I will let you know that Smarter Balanced also has a version. Our version is derived from Smarter Balanced, but I would say lean towards our version because we have more stuff. So for Smarter Balanced, all the states have to agree. There are some things that we in Washington have approved, and our version also includes science. So this is going to be more applicable to you. Additionally, there's a link for the accessibility supports page on our WCAP portal, which has some nice resources for considering what might be appropriate for students. The actual document is linked there as well. And then one of our fabulous, how do you go about trying out speech to text with your students is linked there as well. So our one-off assessment is really around our English language proficiency assessment. We will not spend a lot of time talking about that, but WIDA does have its very own accessibility manual, and accommodation policies are set at the test level, which is why you sometimes will see variation between content areas or across tests. So this is where you need to go to get information for students with disabilities who are also multilingual learners participating in the WIDA assessment. Specific to assistive technology, we have a couple of resources for you. Cambium, who is our test vendor, their assistive technology manual, which will go through some of the most common assistive technologies and what is operable within the secure browser.
What is new for this school year for math, ELA, and science? The biggest thing is that there is now Spanish text-to-speech available for math and science tests, and I'll show you that a little bit later. Is that the Spanish presentation of math and science tests now has two different display options. The new option is where students can switch between only seeing Spanish on the screen, or they can hit a button and they can see all of the test content in English. The buttons and stuff are still in Spanish, so like people have called it the skin or the framing of it is still in Spanish because the assumption is that the student really does need a Spanish test, but they can switch back and forth between the two of them. And that's the default. If the student really prefers to have what we previously had available, where there was Spanish first and then English below that, that is also available to be turned on if the student wants to use that one. The next big thing, and you guys are actually the first audience we're telling, is that the text-to-speech and the ASL buttons are now more visible. I'll show you those in just a moment. And that was asked for by lots of teachers because teachers who had the ASL videos or had text-to-speech, it was just a lot of clicks. And so we've moved that out, and I'll show you where that is now. And we also have printed online English test directions are available for ELA, math, and science tests if students need to read those along with the TA who's leading them through the login process. And Bluetooth hearing aids are now included in the definition of medical supports. And that's really important because a lot of students, their hearing aids are Bluetooth now. And so if they want to hear the listening passage or hear the text-to-speech, then they had the Bluetooth hearing aids. And we have to be really clear. The Bluetooth hearing aids is a designated support is available for any student who has a demonstrated need. And the Bluetooth hearing aids, that's different than the headphones that the student uses to listen to the ELA listening passages. Bluetooth headphones are not allowed for that. We're going to update one of our documents. We had a lot of students listening to their phones on their Bluetooth headphones, and that causes a test incident, and their score can be impacted by that. And so think about the medical support when you're thinking about the Bluetooth hearing aid, not Bluetooth headphones. Who qualifies for the Spanish presentation of the test? This can be any student the student does not have to be in ELD programming in order to get this. A student who maybe was in English language development services as a kindergartner, first grader, and second grader, they passed out a program. They're not getting ELD support services anymore for that language development, but they're still good with seeing and hearing Spanish. They can absolutely have access to the Spanish version of the math or science test. And it can be a student who never tested into ELD services. They're just bilingual and they can access the content in Spanish as well. There's a whole process, and Tony and I have a whole series called Using the Guidelines, Tools, and Supports and Accommodations, where we talk about how you identify for students for these. And we'll talk a little bit more as we go through today about how you would identify students for getting one of the things that are designated supports. Some of these on the screen are accommodations and some of them are designated supports. I'm going to show you text-to-speech and word prediction. So text-to-speech being most of the time it's a designated support. Word prediction is an accommodation, and I'm also going to show you ASL as an accommodation. So this is the context menu where other buttons and tools are. But now if a student has ASL videos, it's right there for them. It's right next to that menu. And if they have text-to-speech, it's right next to that, and they would do speak.
What is the area, in square feet, of the ceiling?
Actually tracking along with what it's saying. And then over here on the passage side of the screen, again, there is the ASL video, and the student can make this bigger, they can make it smaller, they can stop it.
Let's paint a room. Your friend, Sam, wants to paint her room. She wants to paint the ceiling white and the 4 walls purple.
And I can stop it speaking. And when you're in the actual secure browser, there's more students can do. They can you can like select some text. Oh, there it'll do it here. And they can have it just speak that part you want, have repeated for themselves. So I wanted you to see that the visibility of those. And then I also said I would show you word prediction.
What about speeding up and slowing down sound?
Once you're within the test, you can do that. You can change the text-to-speech settings here. So you could change the rate or and you can change the pitch as well. You can do this also during the login process. You have to pass a technology test to make sure it works before the test will let you go in, but you can also do it. And so it's this little cog system settings button right up here. Okay, so then the word prediction is down here. It's built in now, and so I can start typing, and if I just pick a number, or I can click on it and just start typing. So it's not going to predict ahead for me. It's not going to suggest my next word for me. It's just going to give me the word, the current word that I'm working on. So this is embedded, and the student can use that to help them type faster if they need to.
Kara, the question was, can you hover over the words to hear them?
Oh, so because I enabled this test for text-to-speech student responses, I can do that. And so this is this little text-to-speech button here. So the word prediction is still showing up, but those are two separate things you have to turn on. They are not together. They're two separate things.
So is that just after they've inputted text, then they can hear what they inputted? For word prediction, they can hover over the word prediction words to hear them before they select? No, okay.
They can't do that. Yeah. So they can only, they would only be able to, so they would only be able to, they can't do anything in this box itself. You can't, well, you can only select it like that. It's because it's word prediction and the text-to-speech student responses that I have them both on that I can do this.
Yogurt.
We'll come back to some more demonstrations in a little bit.
Quickly,
Here
how
we
you
go.
got to word prediction, this would be a student setting if it is set in our test information delivery system for the student whenever they have an open response box. If it is set for them, then they will see it.
And I will show you a little bit later how to find it in our practice tests so that you can try it out.
Okay, so this is our big theoretical framework of how supports function for state testing. So what's important to note is we have two sides of this. So we have things that are embedded. So these are things that are readily available within the student's test setting when they sit down and have to be, some things are already there, some things have to be turned on. And then we have things that are non-embedded, and I call those somebody's got to bring something for the student to do. So a thing like speech to text is embedded, has an embedded option, but the scribe would be a non-embedded. Like a student can enable and access a scribe in the test platform. That's a human. Somebody has to arrange for the human to be there with the student. So there's embedded and non-embedded. Some supports, you will have an embedded version. So speech to text is embedded, but we also have students who use outside software. So we would consider that non-embedded as well. So it gets kind of tricky. Additionally, you'll see that we have 3 tiers of supports. So our first tier we call universal tools. These are the things that are available to any student. They are in the platform. The student has 100% autonomy of whether or not they choose to use those. Tier 2 is designated supports, and these are for any student with an identified need as determined by a familiar person with the student. So what's the difference there? It's another level. If it's embedded or non-embedded, somebody's got to do something to support the student. So if it's embedded, somebody's got to turn it on. If it's non-embedded, someone's got to make arrangements to provide it. But that does not require any formal documentation. So it does not require that the student have a learning plan or an IEP or a 504. It does not require that. It's just an identified need by an adult familiar with the student. And then that third tier is our accommodations. And these are those things only available to students who have that formal documentation of an IEP or 504. Regardless of which tier the support lives in, OSPI will always encourage that districts and educators engage in a process for determining supports with the student voice included in that. And Kara talked a little bit about translations and how we have some different views of that now, right? We have this toggle option or we have the stacked option. So really we're starting to see in this area of universal tools, designated supports, accommodations, where there's a preference in here, right? Like how does the student best access that? Is stacked on top of each other the best for the student or toggling back and forth? So that is why we will always support and praise any process you can put into place that encourages students, especially at designated supports and accommodations levels, to try out the support in a secure browser and then evaluate the effectiveness of that support, including student in there and accounting for preference, because how text-to-speech renders as the embedded support may be vastly different than what it sounds like for a student using it instructionally. So again, universal tools are available to all students, including those receiving designated supports and those receiving accommodations. It really is student preference. They choose, just kind of like on a Word document, you choose if you want to use the heading structure, you choose when or if you want to bold, you choose when or if you want to zoom in or not. But what's important to note is if you have students where the highlighter might be a distraction, you can also go in and turn it off. So universal tools are always going to be turned on, but somebody can make the decision to turn that off for a student. So it is important to note text-to-speech and speech-to-text are currently not universal tools. These are not things that every student needs. They may use, but is not something everybody needs. So this is an example of the zoom tool. So students can choose to zoom in or zoom out on an item at any time. This, if you go to any of the practice tests, this is how students can try out some of those tools ahead of time for familiarity. We want them to be familiar with how these things function in a test platform, which may be different than how it functions with what they're used to doing, maybe on their device or in whatever online platforms students are utilizing during instruction.
And I'm going to say the designated supports list is a lot longer. I couldn't fit it all on the screen. And those, I chose to show the default with everything that's in the universal tools shows as on, and anything in the designated supports and accommodations shows as off. But you can toggle and use drop-down menus in each of those to set up those settings, which is how I got all of those things turned on the practice test. And I do recommend using a math practice performance task to try things initially with students, because that will give you access to the most tools. And then there are some things that are that function like some things that are available on math are not available on ELA. But most of the things available on math are available on science. And so this is a great place to start. And then once the students decided, then have them practice on the other ones with what's actually available on those.
Designated support, this is that second tier of supports. The use of designated supports is made at the individual student level. So if districts call us and say, hey, we have a fourth grade teacher who wants to give X to every kid with purple hair, we will discourage that practice. We want all decisions to be made at that individual student level, regardless of which tiers they fall in. So the use of designated supports is made at the individual student level. Our guidance is that the decision should be made by adults who have knowledge of possible student needs, working with the parents and or students to make explicit decisions. So the best practice is consistent determination of a process as a determination process as a group who knows the student, including parent. These do need to be identified prior to testing. I think it begs the question that if you're thinking a kid needs it 5 minutes after they've sat down to test, then they probably don't need it unless it was an oversight in which you might need to investigate processes. Student does not need to have an IEP or 504. Text-to-speech is an embedded support for some content areas. So as a designated support.
It's available absolutely at all the science tests, absolutely all the math tests. On ELA, it's complicated. ELA performance task, absolutely all of it. ELA CAT, it's available on the questions. It's not available on the reading passages for the reading questions.
Scribe is also a designated support as non-embedded.
Oh, so this was just showing you how that text-to-speech works. You would first click that speaker button next to the little, called the hamburger menu, the 3 lines, and then you'd hit the speak passage or speak question. And then the side was showing that when you click on the gears, that's when the system settings shows up again to adjust the volume, pitch, and rate. You could also adjust those within the login process. And please note that the English text-to-speech will use whatever voice is available on your computer. This is something that one of the reasons you want students to try it out, because text-to-speech within the secure browser is not like any of the programs that my 3rd grade son listens to books on. It just does not sound the same. David's voice sometimes annoys people. So you might need to find that out ahead of time. And it really it doesn't sound like an Audible reading a book to you. It's really difficult sometimes, and sometimes it pauses in weird places. And some people can do that and some people can't. And so That's why we really discourage everybody with purple hair getting it, and encourage everybody to try it out to see how it goes actually within the test engine before making that decision. So the text-to-speech sound check has to be completed before a student can get into the test. This is new this year. If a student has just an English presentation of the test and they have text-to-speech, they'll get the sound check that's on the left here, and they have to they can change the current voice pack. Mine always goes to David, but they could change that if there's another voice pack that the student prefers that's been loaded on the machine. That would be the place to change that. And then they would press the speaker button, and then it's really faint right now because I didn't press the speaker button yet. You have to press the speaker button. This is that place where you can adjust the volume, pitch, and rate, and then they click the I hear the voice. If the student has the Spanish presentation of the math or science test, they will actually first get the one that's on the right that shows this text-to-speech sound check in the Spanish. And my machine has Raul on it. I can also change it to another one, but you first have to do it with the Spanish voice pack. And once I click the green button at the bottom, then it will flip to my English voice pack, and then David will show up in that line. Everything else will look the same. So you have to actually go through 2 text-to-speech sound checks if you have the Spanish. If you're supposed to have a Spanish math or science test, and the secure browser cannot find a Spanish voice pack on your machine, you cannot go any further. So that's something for technology directors to make sure, especially if you have Windows machines, that if students have that Spanish test and the text-to-speech, that they have that on the machine. We suggest you maybe have a couple spare machines if something goes wrong with the kids' test, so that a couple spare machines that have the Spanish voice pack downloaded. And there's directions in those technology guides that Tony talked about a little bit earlier for how to do this. I'm going to do a demo of the Spanish presentation choices and the Spanish text-to-speech. Again, the first place, use a math practice performance task. You could also do a WCAS, the science training test, if the student's in grades 5, 8, or 11. So when you get to the screen that shows the settings, you're going to change the presentation to Spanish, and then the whole screen will change to Spanish. That's why I provided the screenshot here. And then the text of those at the bottom, this is math, stimuli, and items. It is the only thing on that screen that will not be in Spanish. That gets you the text-to-speech for the stimuli and items. And then the one at the bottom where it says C, that text-to-speech has the student responses.
I can work towards Rachel's question. Do they sound check for each area of the assessment? I believe the answer is yes. And then anytime the student logs out and then logs back in?
Yeah.
So anytime they leave the system and come back, which would be any section of the test, not section, but session.
Yeah, any test
tests.
session. Yeah. Yep, any test session. Anytime they have to go through the login process, they have to do that check, yes. So I've already done it for this one. Now Google is super helpful because I'm in Chrome. The first time I get to this, it asks me if I want to translate this page back to English. So I always have to tell students, don't do that because the secure browser won't do that. But I am in Spanish math performance task. It's all in Spanish. It's all in Spanish. If I want to see this in English, I go up here to this little world button, and then all the text changes to English, but my menu buttons are still in Spanish. I can actually enter something in here. I can type something in here, and I can go back to my Spanish, and it remains there for me. So let's try the Spanish speech to text. So here we go.
Completa la siguiente tabla de frecuencia, usando los datos que muestra la tabla 1. La tabla tiene 3 columnas y 3 filas.
And then, let me go to this question. So here's this.
Crea tu propio método para decidir un ganador usando los votos.
So I can do that. And then if I want to hear it in English, I do this, go back to this, and now I'm on this question. The button's still in Spanish, but then
Create your own method for using the votes to decide a winner. Explain your method using the information from Table 1 to determine the winning pet.
So that is how the Spanish speech to text works. So previously, the students would have only gotten the English version of this. So this is the switching back and forth between the languages. That's the new setting. I'm going to stop sharing because we have lots to share. If we have time, we can come back and I can show you more.
So accommodations was that third tier. Again, we have some embedded supports and then some things that are non-embedded. Someone's got to bring it to the test session. So accommodations is really that level that is reserved for students who have an IEP or a 504, and those accommodations have been pre-identified by the IEP team or the 504 team. Again, this is not something that should ever be a day of testing decision. And especially in these circumstances, we want to make sure the student is using this regularly during daily instruction. And again, those should always be being evaluated with the student in mind. What's important here, some things to note, is that speech to text and word prediction can be both embedded and non-embedded for the student. So again, it becomes kind of that student preference. It just really depends, right? Like that student preference, are they okay with the embedded version, or do we need to use the version that they are used to in the classroom?
So we cannot show you the speech to text accommodation because it only works within the secure browser. So the way to try it out is to use the TA practice interface and to use the student secure browser. We cannot use it in the guest mode that I was showing you, like with all the other things. That is the one thing that we cannot do. So there are full directions for how to do that in the try out speech to text document that Tony linked to on an earlier slide. And how it looks in the student test is it's only for these questions that have this HTML toolbar, most often seen in the ELA or the math performance tasks. And it's that little old-fashioned microphone button. And there's also a speech to text check at the beginning of the test as the student logs in, and the student will click on that button and then they start talking, and then the words starts appearing on the screen. And so if a student is using that a lot in the classroom, please use that tryout speech to text document to try that with the student within the secure browser to see if the embedded option is one that will work for them. The embedded word prediction tool is actually by CoWriter. They worked with Cambium to embed the CoWriter word prediction within the system. So please know that if a student is using CoWriter in the classroom on their machine, that CoWriter is not going to talk to the secure browser. So anything that the student has done in that is not going to go into the secure browser. But how it kind of works with the numbers and stuff should be familiar to students who have been using CoWriter in other programs.
What if you decide that you have a student who needs to use the non-embedded one? We allow that, but what's important to note is you can't use the non-embedded just so you can enable things that the embedded one doesn't allow. If you're using a non-embedded word prediction program, you can only allow single word prediction and basic dictionary, phonetic spelling, and text-to-speech feature. Also consider headphones unless tested individually, and students could use their own AT devices. What is not allowed, so you'd have to go in and deactivate phrase prediction, predict ahead, next word, and deactivate any expanded dictionaries such as topic dictionary or word bank.
The non-embedded accommodation text help can support you in how to do that. But now really with the embedded tool being CoWriter, it's so easy. You know, most people will probably just stick to it that way. Here I had a slide for another vendor called WordQ, and I was kind of double checking up on that, and their whole management changed, the link changed. There's no exam mode that I could find linked on their new website. So I deleted that. So really it's going to depend no matter what. If you have a different word prediction tool than CoWriter, you're going to have to work with the vendor on how to set it up with the criteria that Tony had mentioned earlier. That's really the thing. It can be non-embedded, but it has to be set up with those certain things that are allowed or disallowed in order for it to work.
OSPI does have a process for accommodations and or designated supports that are not addressed in our GTSA. So those can be submitted to the state. What's important is if we've already addressed it in the GTSA, we won't allow you to use something that isn't there. So that's That's important. You will have to answer some questions regarding classroom and instructional use and how it is to be used on the assessment. The next slide, I will talk to you how we evaluate those. We ask ourselves, does the requesting feature go beyond what is already provided and available? For example, we have calculator allowed and calculator not allowed items. We would not allow through this process calculators to be used on non-calculator allowed items. But also this one. Also, we'll ask, does that specific feature in the software violate what the assessment is designed to measure? Again, calculators on non-calculator allowed sections would never be approved. And then we're asking, does that feature give the user access to more additional or more specific context information than is provided to other test takers? So is it giving them an advantage instead of access?
They do have to designate these testing supports in the IEP, right?
It depends. Are we talking about the how is one identified?
How is one typically identified? Teacher request?
It
Maybe.
depends. Maybe, right? So universal tools, no one needs to be identified. Designated supports, again, it needs to be someone who is familiar with the student and the needs of the student. And we strongly encourage you to involve the student in that conversation. For anything at that accommodation level, that is identified by the student's IEP team or the 504 team. Nobody else. The school janitor cannot decide a student needs accommodation. That has to go through the IEP team and it has to be documented in the student's IEP.
And you don't want to decide that all of your students who are getting English language development services, that they all need the Spanish version of the test. I mean, in some places that's a very small portion of the ELD population, but also some students are not getting instruction in that, and they might find the Spanish really not helpful. And so you can't just, there's not an easy, check this box and then all of these kids. And it is particular to which feature we are talking about.
If you have some questions around how am I assessing or trialing, taking data on these accommodations in order to make these decisions, reach out to the Special Ed Tech Center. There are some formal tools such as UPAR to look at text-to-speech if that's needed, which takes some data and lets you know how that improves the student's performance or does not. A big thing with speech to text is really making sure you've trained the student to utilize it. And so we have a training guide that's many educators are using. So the main thing is to be implementing these, not just in the state testing, but with the students. The other thing I was going to mention is if your district does not have an AT consideration process, we're working with many districts on that. On our website under kind of best practices in AT, we have a nice decision tree on assistive technology within the IEP with the data you have, and also the difference between consideration and assessment.
Is there something you guys, come across when you're implementing where you get stuck or you have a question about it, or maybe you want to share how you've done it successfully? We just wanted to give an opportunity for sharing. So if you want to say something, you could put it in the chat window. William's asking, do you have a link to that decision tree? We should be able to get that.
What is the best way to have students utilize speech to text? Well, that's a great question. I think like Tony Wheeler probably needs to be tested in a separate space, or Tony Wheeler is going to be really loud and distracting. So I think that's kind of some of the trying it out, is kind of thinking about what dynamics are going to work. Some students, if there's a lot of people talking, that could be very distracting for some test takers, even if they have headphones. So I think those are some of those considerations around setting where you're going to actually test the student that need to be thought through. I wouldn't put a whole classroom together of 15, 20 kids. I think when we talk about small group, I think we're thinking 3 to 5, but I think it all depends on your space. 3 to 5 kids in a closet is very different than 3 to 5 kids spread out in a classroom or something like that. So those are things you're just gonna have to evaluate the number. You're gonna have to evaluate the space. You might also consider like that might be the time when you have like a 3rd grader testing with the 5th grader, so they're not responding to similar content at the same time, which could be really confusing. Or do you have dividers that you could put up to muffle some of the ambient sound in the rooms? We don't know your testing scenario to really tell you what's the best way, but those are things I'd be thinking about. Number of students, the space you have available, and then kind of other factors around students and their needs.
I was just going to reiterate Kristen's comment at using noise canceling headsets for when you're doing speech to text, especially in like a testing setting, would probably be really important. And SETC has some available if you want to check some out, try them out.
Christy asked really early on about read aloud accommodations. Like she said, does it not need to be pre-approved? Does it have to be pre-approved by OSPI? Read aloud is an accommodation. It's in it. So if it's in the GTSA as allowed, does not need any pre-approval by OSPI. It does require marking in TIDE ahead of time, and the person who is doing the read aloud, there's some read aloud guidelines. I think if you look in the GTSA in that section about read aloud, it talks about that. The person who's being the reader has to follow those read aloud guidelines. And because then it's an accommodation, yes, it does need to be in an IEP or 504 plan, but it does not need further justification from you at the district that a student needs it. And you also have to think for speech to text, what tests are they doing? The ELA performance task is a big, long old essay. So that's different than students doing a math performance task who might be, doing math and then like speaking out a short answer. So that's something to consider with the students for putting them in the same room together.
Here's a great question. Does anyone know if IEP Online can produce a spreadsheet of 504 testing accommodations? That's a great question. Anyone know out there in our group?
That question came to us earlier this week too. I'm thinking that IEP Online probably is not a place where you're capturing 504 information. They have both. Christy says they have both. Excellent. Kathy Booth says yes. Apparently you can get to that. Somebody else says they don't house 504s in IEP Online, so you might have to pull from, they're saying Skyward, but that would be your local student information system. This would be something I would go to your district assessment coordinator.
So as far as where they go when they have questions beyond this webinar, the Special Ed Tech Center is a great place to go if you are considering assistive technology, needing some support with what does AT assessment look like, those decisions that the IEP team needs to make ahead of time. But as far as specifics on testing, should I share the slides again? Do we ever?
And if you have questions about a support, we do have a GTSA email address, which I just put in the chat. That is another great place to send questions, or you can email myself or Kara Todd on here. So even if you have a question, like I would say, like, do I need to apply for a non-standard accommodation for this? Go ahead and reach out first. Like we'll guide you through whether or not we will most likely approve or not. Or if you're just like, what about this? I'm really good at logicking out, because sometimes there is a disconnect between what we call it in the IEP or call it in instruction compared to what the test named it. So even there, helping to strengthen that connection between what could that look like and is it already captured?
The PowerPoint that you're seeing today, we'll have that posted on the SETC website. And then we'll probably also have an easy way on our YouTube channel to get to the whole session recording. So please share this with your colleagues that couldn't make it here today. And special thank you to Tony and Kara, who worked really hard on all this information that we've updated.
Thank you all for spending your time with us.
Thank you.
And special thanks to Kristen.
No problem.
Have a great day, everyone.